Okay, so today we will be talking about Bible history or the Bible timeline. We're basically going to have an overview of the different Bible stories and how do they fit in this timeline of the Bible. Most of us, we read the Bible in different times. Sometimes we go, from beginning to end, and sometimes we just read different parts. And some of us may have a hard time figuring out, okay, well, which story comes first? We obviously know Adam and Eve comes in the beginning, but then we hear about Abraham, we hear about Daniel and Esther and Jonah. And sometimes it's hard for us to understand, okay, well, where do they fit in the timeline? So this is what we're going to be doing today. We're just going to have a general overview together. And I am very excited about what we will be talking about today. So first thing to keep in mind is that the Bible is one big story. It's not just stories that are collected and placed into a book, but rather there is a direction that the story is going. There is a beginning and a middle and an end, and it goes very much chronologically. And if we look at here on the right side of the screen, you would see that the Bible books are kind of separated into, let's say, categories. And you would see that some of the books are considered history. And these history books, they do follow chronologically. And in general, when you read the Bible, it does follow this one kind of chronological line. Now, we will be mostly focusing on the Old Testament here, but we will be talking here and there a little bit about the New Testament. And as we are going today, you will see some things that hint to the things that happen in the New Testament as well. And they are very kind of fun Easter eggs, as some people call them, that really connect with kind of with what happens later. All right. I'm just making sure we're here. 1 second. Okay. So again, this is another picture of showing just the different Bible books and how they fit into the story. The main history books are the ones in green, right in the middle. You see that Chronicles overlap with Kings and Samuel, and that's because they follow the same stories. But then we have the books like different, more poetic books or different prophets and how they fit into these stories. But what we'll be following is basically the main story from beginning to end. So this is kind of a little bit of a summary of what we will be going in. Okay, and one more thing that I want us to kind of keep in mind as we are going through today. First, we're going to be going through different time periods that shaped the Bible history. We're going to talk a bit about what happened in the beginning, but then we will follow different periods that kind of historians have established or placed to kind of help to transition from one story to another, or from one, let's say, area or period to another. So we will start with the Canaanite period, go into the Judges, Israelite period, and so on and so forth. And we will end talking about Jesus and the Roman period up here. And one more thing that we will be looking at throughout, and this is one of my favorite parts, is that we're going to be answering and looking at the question of, is the Bible historically accurate? And are there evidences of the story in the Bible from archaeology and history? So I hope you're excited. I know I am very excited. So let us begin. Speaking of let's begin, in the beginning, science believes, or history, they basically place the stories of Adam and Eve and the whole stories in Genesis, or the creation, being around 4000 BC, about 6,000 years ago. So we know that in the beginning, God created the world in 6 days. On the sixth day, he created Adam and Eve. And we know that soon after that, sin entered the world, right? And from the beginning, we get this promise from God that there would be someone who's coming from the seed of the woman who is going to crush the head of the serpent, right? So we could already tell from the beginning that God knows the end of the story, way from the book of Genesis, way from the beginning. And as you would see throughout today's lesson, we're going to be noticing this theme throughout of God's faithfulness and his protection over his people, and his constant salvation and saving his people. The more they are trusting in him, the more they are obedient to him, how very quickly he comes and saves them and protects them. And one of the instances that we hear about God's faithfulness and his protection, for example, is in the story of Noah and the flood. Now, the story of Noah, again, it happens in the book of Genesis, and it happens around 2500 BC. And we all know the story. God tells Noah that he's going to send rain over the earth, that it's going to flood everything. So he tells him to build this big ark and bring two animals of every kind. And he protected them and after the big flood, Noah and his family ended up repopulating the earth, right? And this brings us to our first point of Bible meets history. These are the different checkpoints that we will be kind of pausing in between to talk about the different moments in which history and archaeology overlap in the Bible. So this big story about the big flood, it seems a little bit like legendary or something kind of big and sometimes hard to imagine. So historians and archaeologists sometimes wonder, well, are there actual evidences of the flood in history? Can we see this evidences of that? Did it actually happen? Did it not? And the more that they started to discover things, the more they found different clues that said that actually the flood did happen. One of the things that they found, for example, are different books or stories from very ancient times, from the Roman times and the Greek times, and even the Babylonian times. There were different kind of mythology and epics and stories that were written that mention a great big flood. And for example, we have the story of Deucalion and Pyria and the Epic of Gilgamesh and so on and so forth. And I'm not saying that mythology is true, but what I am saying is that the great big flood must have inspired these stories to be written way back then, thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago. So yes, there are evidences of there have been a flood in which people knew, and it was passed down through generations, that there was a flood that covered the earth and people had to repopulate and go around the rest of the world again. So we have mentions of the flood from way back then, but also, and even this is the one that I'm most excited to tell you about, is that historians and archaeologists also wanted to find actual remains of the ark. And for many years now, they call them like the ark hunters, or kind of these hunters of ancient treasures or ancient kind of archaeology and these kinds of stuff. So what they do is they read these Bible stories and they focus on these different verses to try to find clues on where these things such as the ark may have been. Do they even still exist for now? So one verse, for example, in Genesis chapter 8, verse 4 says, "And on the 17th day of the 17th month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat." And the mountains of Ararat are known where they are today. And so people, these archaeologists, they went and they were searching around on the mountains of Ararat to see, can they find remains of the ark? And I want to show you some of the finds that they have found, which is very fascinating. Some of you may have seen it, but for those of you who aren't, I hope you get excited about this as I do. They found this very big formation on one of the hills on the mountain that if you look at it, it really looks like the shape of the ark, right? And what they also found is when they actually measured it out, it measured almost exactly to the exact measurements that are mentioned in the scripture. We know that actually God gave Noah the exact measurements. And so we have something to refer back to. And so they measured it out and they found that this must have been where the ark had landed and where it stayed there for thousands of years. Now, of course, wood wouldn't last around 4,500 years, so we probably won't see the remains of the wood itself. So it probably decayed and dissolved over time. But up until now, this is the closest thing that they have found. Now, in general, when it comes to history and archaeology and things to do with the Bible, geologians or historians are not so kind of quick to agree that this is 100% accurate, probably because most of them don't really believe in the Bible, but also they are usually a bit skeptic. And so many of them said that this is probably just a geological formation of the mountain, but I think it's too much of a coincidence that the exact measurements fit and the location is right. But also when they sent in radar technology, they started to see, for example, here in the bright blue area, you see a lot of parallel lines that show that this is not something geological or random, but must have been something man-made. So this is just kind of a little fun Bible meets history point that I wanted to show you. And it is really exciting. And hopefully one day they would actually prove it and say that, yes, this is it. For now, they say there's probably like 99%, 99.9%. I'm still going with this until proven otherwise. All right. So yes, so we were talking about Noah up until now, and the stories of Adam and Eve and Noah and the other stories, they all happened in the book of Genesis. And you would see right underneath the title, where I'm going to have a title almost on every slide, you would see the years, which, as I mentioned, the beginning was around 4000 BC. And right beside it, in parentheses, would be a Bible book, which is believed to have been the stories that were taking place, or the stories that are mentioned during this time, or during the time that, or during the kind of what is mentioned on that page. Okay, so up until now, and for quite a few more slides, we're going to be talking in the book of Genesis. So as mentioned, that was in the beginning. Noah happened around 2500 BC. And the story of the Tower of Babel is believed to have been kind of around 100 years after that, not much long after that, because we know the story that the people were all from one language. They decided to build a big tower, and God decided to introduce languages so that they would disperse and actually go and live all over the world. So that is believed to have happened around this time. All right, and from there we finish this period of in the beginning, and we're actually entering into more the history periods that were mentioned in the timeline earlier. And so we're entering a period called the Canaanite period, and it's the main period in which we hear a lot of the stories that happened, like the Abraham and the patriarchs and so on and so forth. And in other places in like the history books, they also probably refer to this period as the Bronze Age. All right, so just kind of, if for those of you who are familiar with history, it's around this time. So the Canaanite period. Canaanite, of course, it references the name of Canaan, or the land of Canaan, where most of the stories took place. And the name Canaan is actually the name of he's a grandson of Noah. So Noah had three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now Ham's son is called Canaan. And so Canaan and his descendants were called the Canaanites, and they settled mainly in this land. And from here on out, we found that this land of Canaan is the main land in which most of the stories of the Bible take place. But it wasn't called Israel or Judea at the time. It was still just the Canaanite period. And so we start to hear, as I mentioned, about the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and so on. So God calls Abraham all the way from Ur of the Chaldeans and brings him here to the land of Canaan. And these stories begin. He promises him his descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the heavens. And, we hear a lot about the stories of Abraham. Now, when it comes to evidences of whether Abraham or if whether this person, Abraham, existed or not, well, history doesn't actually have, or archaeology, they didn't actually find remains of him or of his home or, of the places like from his home or remains of who he is. But to be honest, that's not really a deal breaker, because we also know of Abraham that he was a nomad, or he was nomadic. He traveled from one place to another. He lived in tents. And if we try to associate him with a kind of group of people today, it's probably like the Bedouins, who you don't really leave a lot of remains. So that you don't usually expect to be remains from a person like Abraham. But from the places that he has visited, or from the places that are mentioned in the Bible, like Beersheba and Shechem and Hebron, and those places, we can still visit them today. The traditions go on, and the stories of Abraham are directly related to these places. Another thing to mention before we move on is that the book of Job, or the story of Job, is believed to have happened during the Canaanite period as well. Probably a little bit before, but generally speaking, it is around that time. So after Abraham, we know that Abraham had Isaac, and that Isaac had his twin sons, right? We had Esau and Jacob, and we know that Jacob had 12 sons, okay? And with the story of Jacob, actually, we know that he left the land of Canaan for a while, and then he came back, and on his way back, his name changed from Jacob to Israel, which is why Jacob's 12 sons became known as the 12 tribes of Israel. Eventually, they were still the 12 sons at this point. And from here, we start to see that there's a shift in the story, taking them from Canaan down into Egypt. You know the stories, of course. Jacob had a favorite son, Joseph. His brothers didn't like him so much, so they sold him into slavery. And Joseph rose to power in Egypt, and with a big, beautiful reunion and kind of reconciliation with his family, all of his 11 brothers moved to Egypt with him, where they grew, and they eventually became the 12 tribes of Israel. So again, the story a little bit moved from the Canaanite period down, or from the Canaanite land, the Canaan land, to Egypt. One thing I forgot to mention, that the Canaanite period is believed to have been around 3600 BC until about 1200 BC. Okay, and it's still going on. We're still kind of in the middle of that. And so, yes, the story shifted and moved to Egypt. And with that, we're doing another little checkpoint, another Bible meets history. And this is from a little bit later, from around 12,017 BC, but they found this this kind of slab of stone, which they called a stele, and this one specifically is the Merneptah stele. And a stele is basically the slab of stone which has writings on it, which declare like a victory or the life of a person, probably like an emperor or a pharaoh or something like that. But this one specifically, interestingly enough, mentions the name Israel. And it's one of the earliest mentions of that name. And it's actually mentioned Israel at the time because it is believed that they didn't pronounce the letter L, but Israel or Israel is mentioned on this stela, on this kind of big stone, along with a few more cities in the land of Israel. So I think this is another kind of fun fact that it is mentioned way early on in the beginning, from the time where we're kind of close to the story of the time in Egypt and a little bit later. Now, we're just doing an overview of the stories. Most of them, we're just kind of running through the story line. We're heading in one direction. So while they are in Egypt, we know that the 12 tribes of Israel grew in number, and the Egyptians were becoming threatened by that. They thought that maybe this group of people who are going to overcome us and they're going to take over the country. So instead, they decided to enslave them. And we know that the Israelites called out to God, or the Hebrews, they called out to God for a savior, and God raised Moses and sent him to deliver them. And so Moses goes to King Pharaoh, or to the Pharaoh, and he tells him, let my people go. And the picture we have here, of course, we know that God sent the 10 plagues, which finally convinced Pharaoh to send them out. And they finally get to the Red Sea. When the Pharaoh returning, kind of coming after them, the sea split wide open. And God said, let his people walk in on dry land. Now, again, these kinds of stories of things happening in Egypt that are so great, like the 10 plagues and the parting of the Red Sea and this big group of people leaving the land and so on and so forth, historians say, well, if that was that big of a deal, it must have been mentioned in history, right? Now, in many cases, some things in history may not have been found, but I mean, you can't completely disrule it immediately, because one, they could still be probably hidden and we still have to look for them. But also, second, the other reason why they're finding a hard time finding them is probably like the Egyptians, you don't really want to write about their failures, but rather write about their victories. This is another reason. But also, some say that maybe the dating that the historians have for the time of the Exodus must have happened at a different time. And if that is the case, there are different kind of theories and stories that actually mention some things that are very parallel to the stories of the Exodus. And I want to mention a couple of them. For example, they found this papyrus called the Apower Papyrus. And I put a question mark here and there because it is not 100% proven that this is related to the Exodus, but I still think it's fun because it does have some parallels, which you will notice and recognize. I wrote some of the things out that are mentioned in this very long papyrus, this very long writing. And one of the things, for example, that is mentioned in the papyrus are things like the river is blood, or everywhere barley has perished and the land is without light. And you can already recognize that these words very much remind us of the different plagues, like darkness covered the land, right? Or that there wasn't enough food, that the cattle were struggling to survive. Obviously, the river's blood is a very clear one. But also, there's another one that said, men are few, and he who places his brother in the ground is everywhere. And that reminds me, at least, of the last plague, the one where the firstborn in every household perished and died. And remember, one of the scriptures says that in every household there was mourning. And I think this line over here very much reminds us of that story. And one last one that I mentioned here, of course, there are many more, but it says, indeed, poor men have become owners of wealth, and he who could not make sandals for himself is now a possessor of riches. And I don't know about you, but this reminds me of when the Israelites left Egypt. They were asked to actually go into their neighbor's house, and their neighbors gave them things to take with them. So the Israelites did not leave the land empty-handed. And so these things, they seem a little too much of a coincidence to have been mentioned in one papyrus, but I mean, we don't know for sure. But this is one theory, that it must have been maybe a little bit earlier on. But another theory about this is they say that it might have kind of associated it with more something like the aftermath of a big thing that happened around the same time, which was like a big volcanic eruption. Find that there was a volcanic eruption of Santorini, which they say that if that there are ways that you could see that it would have affected kind of like these events, things, something after another, that may have caused the 10 plagues. For example, the water could have been very, very acidic, which caused a lot of sicknesses and that kind of thing. But if you want to hear more about that, I recommend that you search it up on your own time. And if we ever have a chance to talk again, I would love to hear about it. But just things to kind of keep in mind, these different theories. Now, the older back we go, the more time we go back in history, it's harder to find proofs because time is moving forward. But the more modern we come, or more later on in the Bible history, we start to see facts that are a little bit more proven. But the more they are further behind, a little bit harder to find like the exact dating and that kind of thing. And while history is getting better and archaeology is getting better, I think there is still a chance for it to get even more better and more accurate as time moves forward. So we had a little bit of a break with the Bible meets history. I hope you're all doing well and that this is very interesting and exciting for you. I know it is for me. So we are going to continue in the history part, in the moving on with the story. So we know they crossed the Red Sea and they stayed for 40 years in the deserts. And it's during this time that God shows them his faithfulness and his provision. He provided, for example, the manna and the quail so that they don't die from hunger in the desert. He sent water from a rock, right? He led them by a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire. And he even told them to build a tabernacle so he would be with them wherever they are going while they are wandering in the desert. And these stories of the time in the wilderness are mentioned in Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and partly in Exodus as well. So here we are moving forward in the story, and we're nearing kind of the end of the first 5 books. And from here, we start hearing about, the story starts to transition into the promised land. Now, right before we get into this, I want to go back 40 years for right before they entered the wilderness. And I want to ask, did you know that actually it could have taken them only 11 days to get from Egypt to the promised land? Yep, it shouldn't have taken them very long. But we know of this very important and iconic story that happened right before God sends them into the wilderness to wander for 40 years. And that is that Moses sends 12 spies into the promised land to see this land that God was giving to them. And 10 of these 12 people actually came back complaining. They couldn't trust that God was going to protect them and that he was sending them into something good, and instead said that they are going to crush us. We can't do it. We can't go in there. But 2 of these people, who are Joshua and Caleb, they said, no, we can do this. God is on our side. And they even brought back this very iconic, this big cluster of grapes, and they brought it back to Moses and told him, look, this land is very fruitful and it is a wonderful land that God has promised us. We can do this. But because most of the people had this heart of fear and they did not want to go in, God punished them by sending them 40 years in the desert. And even in the midst of that, as we saw, he was with them and guiding them and teaching them that, hey, he can be trusted and they can depend on him. Okay, and one more fun thing to kind of mention about this picture right here, or this kind of iconic scene of the 2 people and the grapes, it became the symbol of the ministry of tourism today. And it's those 2 people that decided, actually, despite everything that they're hearing in the world, despite of everything that is bad that they hear about this land that is over here, they decided to see the goodness of it and they decided to see God's promises in the land. And so you could say that these 2 people right here were the first 2 tourists, and every other tourist, they're all the other visitors, and you guys are following in their footsteps and seeing the goodness of the land. So one of these 2 peoples, as mentioned, was Joshua. And from here, the story transitions from Moses kind of to Joshua. He gets given the mantle, and he's the one who brings the people from the wilderness and takes them into the promised land. And we know this very amazing story that happens as they were entering, is that they're faced with this big city called Jericho, which had its big walls. And we know that the walls came tumbling down. Right? This story kind of happens right as they are entering. And when they entered in, finally, it was time to give each of their tribes their allocated or designated land for them to live in. Okay, and these stories, of course, because of the main character, they're mentioned in the book of Joshua. Okay, so now that we have kind of come out of Egypt and been in the wilderness and coming back into the land, we start a whole different time period. We finally finished the Canaanite period and are entering the Judges period, or the time of the Judges. So it's believed to have been around 1200 BC and continued until around 1004 BC. And again, for those of you who know the history, kind of world history, it's around the Iron Age. Okay, so this is kind of the Judges period, starts around that same time. And in this picture, you see the different, the land that was given to the different 12 tribes. And what happened in the book of Judges, or the Judges period, it is that this time was kind of led by this group of individuals who were called the judges. And basically they were prophets that God was speaking to, and they were leading the people during this time, during the time where they were kind of taking ownership of the land that they were given. And as the name suggests, it all happened in the book of the Judges. So they were going around in the land of Canaan, and they were dealing with different oppressors or different people who were fighting them along the way, like the Edomites, Moabites, the different tribes of the Canaanites, Midianites, Ammonites, and also the Philistines. Here's supposed to have been a break right there. And yeah, so we hear about different stories here in the book of Judges. And like we hear, for example, about Deborah, we hear about Gideon, we hear about Samson, and many of these people who were called the judges, and they led the different groups of people, and sometimes actually during the same time, but just in different places, because the people were it wasn't a kingdom. There was no king or leader over them. It was just God and these prophets who were leading and guiding the people. And the story is slowly going to be shifting from now on. But I do want to mention these two other kind of prophets that were very important to the story. One was Eli and the second was Samuel. And I hope you remember the story. Samuel was a little boy, and remember, he heard the voice of God. He went to Eli, and God was speaking to Samuel from when he was very young, and Samuel ended up becoming the last judge over the people, because we slowly start to see that it's going to shift to this period or this era of being led by the kings, but it's not quite there yet. Now, it is also believed that the book of Ruth happened during this time, during the period of the Judges. And it's pretty easy, this one, to figure out, because we know that Ruth came from Moab right here. And she moved into this land of Canaan, and she, or the land of Judah, and she got married to Boaz, who was an Israelite, and they had their son Obed, and Obed was the father of Jesse, who was the father of David, who became one of the kings of Israel. So we already see that it's connected that way, that it must have happened during the period of the Judges. And that gives us a hint that we are about to talk about David in the next slide. Okay, so the year is around 1025 BC. Israel asks for a king. Up until now, they are living in tribes, different groups of people in different parts of the land, and some of them are actually separated from each other. And they were going to Samuel, who was, as I mentioned, the last judge at the time, or a judge, let's say, at the time, and they were telling him, we want to be like everyone else. We want to be united under one king. Set up a king for us so that we will have a kingdom like the other groups of people. And so Samuel goes to God, and he seeks him about this, and God tells him, they're not rejecting you, Samuel, they're rejecting me as their king. And he still gives them their desire, and he sets Saul to be their king. And Saul was okay at first, but then we know that he disobeyed God. So God instead sought someone after his own heart. And so he sends Samuel to go to a little shepherd boy, or a young shepherd boy, in the village of Bethlehem, and anoints him to become king. And yes, we know about this person being called David. Right? David was called and known as a man after God's own heart, and he's someone who trusted God and trusted God's timing, and we saw God's hand over him very powerfully throughout the many stories, like Goliath, and this is just one of the amazing stories about King David. Now, or David still at the time. He's not a king quite yet. Now, we know that also David was not only a shepherd, but he was also a warrior at heart, as well as a musician. And he wrote these amazing Psalms. So the Book of Psalms is associated very much with David, although he was not the only writer in the Book of Psalms, but it is mostly associated with him. So we're putting it kind of around this time. But there are other other writers as well in the Book of Psalms, and most of the stories of kind of the end of the Judges period and moving into the stories of the kings or the David and Saul happened in 1st and 2nd Samuel. So David was anointed to be king when he was still a teenager, very young, but it was only at the age of 30 did he actually become king. And when he first became king, he became king in Hebron, which is right down here. Okay, he served in Hebron as king for 7 years before he decided to go and capture the city of Jerusalem. And up until now, actually, Jerusalem wasn't part of any of the 12 tribes. So he chose the strategic location, which was kind of neutral and in a very good place, that he captured it and he made it the capital of the United Monarchy of Israel. And from then on, it has been the capital and very known and famous throughout the Bible and throughout history as well. So this is Hebron right here. Jerusalem is right up there. So the kingdom of David was finally united. Everyone was together under this one king, and this land was bigger than even the land that was today. The borders went around differently. We see that it stretched over to the eastern side of the Jordan River, which is in the land of Jordan today. And in some maps, it even shows that it probably went up all the way into Syria as well. It was a very big kingdom. And it actually got historians and archaeologists to question, well, if King David was this famous of a king and very well known throughout history, why don't they have enough remains from him or mentions of who he is? So for many years, they actually thought that King David was just a legend, that he was just a story that was passed on. They didn't believe that he actually existed until they found this stone in an area called Tel Dan, which is in the northern part of Israel, and you can visit it today. It is very, very beautiful, and there are springs that kind of run out from Dan. But the most important thing about it is that they found this stone, which is another stela. Remember, like the Merneptah stela that we saw earlier. But what's interesting about this one is that it specifically mentions the house of David, or in Hebrew, it says that Beit David. And it was irrefutable fact that David was known in history, and his house and his family and his lineage was known from that time. And as I mentioned, if there are some things that we haven't, that they're saying that it don't exist, is probably because they just haven't found them yet. And this is just one perfect example. And I'm sure there is so much more that is yet to be discovered. And speaking of the house of David, we know that God made this promise to David actually in several different ways, but this is just one of the verses that mentions it. God tells David, your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me, and your throne will be established forever. And we know that this is one of the many verses that actually are prophecies about the coming Messiah. And so people knew, reading these verses and reading the different ones, that the Messiah was going to come, and he was going to come from the line of David. Okay, so David was king in let's say in this land and in Jerusalem for about 40 years or so. All right, but after King David, his son Solomon becomes king, and Solomon is well known as being the wise king, and people from all over the world came to see this wisdom of this king. And we know that he wrote different books in the Bible, like the Proverbs and the Ecclesiastes, and probably Song of Solomon as well. And we also know that King Solomon is also mostly associated with building the temple. Up until now, they had the tabernacle, which was moving from place to place. But this is the first time in history where they set up one location, and they built it up for God's glory to kind of be with them there in Jerusalem. And so they set up this big, magnificent temple in Jerusalem, kind of a little bit more above the city. But yeah, so this temple was set up, and we know that during King Solomon's time, there was peace and prosperity in the land. But what happened after that is a whole different story, because we know that right after King Solomon, around 928 BC, basically Solomon's son, when Solomon's son became king, they were not doing that great. They weren't following God that great, and the kingdom splits. It becomes two separate kingdoms. The northern kingdom was called the Kingdom of Israel, and one of Solomon's leaders decided to take the people basically and kind of rebel against the king and took them there. And it was basically made up of 10 tribes. the 10 tribes of Israel who were living in that area. And the lower kingdom where Jerusalem was called the kingdom of Judah. From this point on, it was made up of 2 of the tribes. But you see Jerusalem was right over here. Okay, now the kings who were there, Rehoboam was the son of Solomon, and Jeroboam was the army leader who became king in Israel. Okay, so we've got right now Israel and Judah. And one very interesting thing that happened in the northern kingdom of Israel is that Jeroboam decided or noticed that if the temple and all the temple worship was located in Jerusalem, he had to find a way to keep the people up in the kingdom of Israel so that they don't go back to their king. And he did something which is a little hard to understand, but nevertheless the Bible mentions it, is that he set up 2 different altars and golden calves in 2 different locations in the kingdom of Israel. And one was in Dan, which is the same place, by the way, that they found the stone that mentions the house of David. But so you can see it actually today, you could see the altar, but also in Bethel. And he set up golden calves. I mean, come on, it's already showing that it's going into idolatry and paganism and completely against following God as their ruler, as their king, right? And it already can tell us that this is heading in a not so good direction for the kingdom of Israel. Now, it is during this time that we also hear about these different prophets. The book of Isaiah was written during this time, the book of Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah. His story happened during this time, and the book of Micah. These prophets who wrote these books were all written during this time. Now, it wasn't just one king in the kingdom of Israel and one king in the kingdom of Judah during this whole time of kind of like the kings or the kings being changed. They were a little bit mixed. Some were good kings and some were bad kings. So we hear things like, and this king did evil in the sight of the Lord, or this king was righteous in the sight of the Lord, or this king was perfect in the eyes of the Lord. You had these different kind of labels or these titles or these kind of explanations about these different kings as you would read in these books, like the books of the First and Second Kings and First and Second Chronicles as well. They talk about this changing of the different kings that were going on and what happened during their time. And one example of this is King Ahab. King Ahab was considered one of the bad kings, and he was the king during the time of Elijah. You know, Elijah went up against Jezebel and Ahab, and it mostly happened in the area of the Carmel. And the Carmel is more around right up here, so we could already tell it was in the kingdom of Israel. But yeah, and generally speaking, most of the kings of Israel were considered the not so good kings. They were considered bad kings. When it comes to the kingdom of Judah, they were more mixed. Some were good and some were not good. All right, and we will see that actually does have effect to what happens a little bit later. And that is when the Assyrians come. When the Assyrians, this big kind of kingdom or this big empire, come in and they were conquering and taking the land, the northern kingdom of Israel falls first. It falls around the year 722, and the people of the kingdom of Israel, those 10 tribes, get expelled out of their land and kind of sent into exile to different parts of the Assyrian Empire, different parts of the world. And being that 10 tribes, up until today, some don't know where they went, and so they call them the 10 lost tribes of Israel. But the 2 others remained, which were in the kingdom of Judah. They lasted a little bit longer. But another fun fact about what happened in the kingdom of Israel, when those people were going to exile and were being sent out, the land was being more vacant. And so the Assyrians were bringing in people from all over the world, from all over their Assyrian empire, and bringing them in to settle in this land instead. And one group of people you might be familiar with that came in during this time, or is believed to have come during this time, are the Samaritans, or the people who settled in the Samaritan mountains, which connects, of course, to many stories that we know about in the New Testament, right? So it's believed that this was their origin story, that they came from that time and settled over here. Now, as I mentioned, the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah, did last a while longer. And I do believe that a big part of it is because the kings were turning back to God every now and then. All right, one of the kings, for example, that we hear about during the exact same time of the Assyrian captivity was King Hezekiah. Now, King Hezekiah started out as being more of a prideful king, but he did humble himself before God, and God gave him another chance. And it is during King Hezekiah's time that the Assyrians were coming to capture the land of Judah and to capture Jerusalem. But they held their position in Jerusalem and they resisted them, and it lasted a long time. It lasted much longer than the northern kingdom of Israel were before they went into exile. And one of the things that we hear about in the Bible was that Hezekiah, sorry, I misspelled it right here, was that King Hezekiah built a tunnel while he was in Jerusalem during the time of the Assyrians. And we're going to quickly look at what is said about this tunnel. It says in 2 Chronicles 32 verse 30 that it was Hezekiah who blocked the upper outlet of the Gihon spring and channeled the water down to the west side of the city of David, and he succeeded in everything he undertook. Now, for those of you who have been to the city of David, it is believed that was the ancient Jerusalem, or Jerusalem during that time. And for those, again, who have been there, you might have heard about Hezekiah's tunnel. And as this verse mentions over here, is that Hezekiah realizes that if they wanted to resist the Assyrians a little longer, they needed water. And there was a spring that was flowing a little bit outside the city. So what he did is they built a tunnel that collected the water from the spring and channeled it into the city to collect in a pool, which became known as the Siloam pool or the Shiloach pool. By the way, there are connections to it in the New Testament as well, but we're not going into that. Now, why am I mentioning this? It is because if you go into the city of David, you actually first see Hezekiah's tunnel, and you see that it was that exactly as it says that there was water connecting from the spring into the city is there today. And it's a fascinating experience that you can actually go and walk through Hezekiah's tunnel. And it is a lot of water in there, but you can still walk through it, and it is an amazing experience. And if you haven't done that, put that on your kind of bucket list to kind of do it next time you come to Israel. But one more thing they found over there was this inscription. It was very near to the tunnels or in the city of David, and it basically writes the details of the tunnel, or more like it says the story of the groups of people who were chiseling from both ends of the tunnel, chiseling, and how they met in the beginning, and how the experience was like, what they were hearing, and then finally when they got excited that they connected the tunnel from both sides. And when historians and archaeologists, they dated this back, and they researched to find when this plaque kind of fit in history, they found that it dated exactly to the time of Hezekiah. So if this is not Bible meets history, I don't know what is. Okay. So up until now, we were talking that the the kingdom of Israel fell to the Assyrians, but the kingdom of Judah lasted a while longer. And after Hezekiah, there were a few more kings that were there as well, and they lasted a bit longer. But then they did have some not so good kings, and when the Babylonians came, Jerusalem fell. Okay, and we know that the leader who captured Jerusalem was Nebuchadnezzar, and you recognize this name, of course, from the later stories, right? So the Babylonians come and they take Jerusalem and they destroy the temple and they take the Israelites into captivity. Okay, and this story happened around 586 BC, and it is a very known year because it was very devastating for the people to lose their beloved Jerusalem and to lose this beloved temple that was built by Solomon, this magnificent place where everyone was worshiping. And so it's pretty much a big deal, and a lot of prophets wrote about it in their books. They're mentioned, and during this time, these books were written: Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Jeremiah, Lamentations. These were the books that were telling the people repent, and because Jerusalem is about to get captured and that kind of thing. But we know that Jerusalem does get captured, and they are sent into the 70 years exile. Now, Ezekiel and Daniel are two books that were actually written in Babylon during this time of the 70 years in which they were in Babylon. But before we get there, I do want to mention this one more kind of Bible meets history fact, again connecting to the city of David, and that is that they found these little clay seals. And what is interesting about these seals is that in the city of David, they found this room which was burnt. Okay, there were signs of a lot of burning, which is believed to have been, the time where Jerusalem was captured. And they found these seals, which looked kind of like coins, were not that big, but they would be sealed over these kind of rolled up scrolls with like rope taped rolled around it to know, that these books were not opened or that kind of thing. And because they are clay, if the room was burnt, that meant that clay hardened over time, which meant that it lasted and we could see them today. So they found around 50, if not more, of these little seals, and they called them the bula or the bulai. Now, what is very fascinating about these bulai is that they found different names written on each one of them. And some of the names that are written are actually mentioned directly in the Bible, specifically in the book of Jeremiah. And Jeremiah, as I mentioned, was one of the prophets that lived at exactly around that time, during the time of the Babylonian captivity. So one of the names that we hear is Gemaryahu ben Shaphan. And this person is mentioned in the book of Jeremiah 36, verse 10. And he's one of the kind of the scribes of the king who had his own kind of room over there. So he's mentioned in Jeremiah 36, verse 10, the specific person. And also we found the names Yehuchal ben Shalamyahu and Gedaliah ben Pashhur, who were two of the four people mentioned in Jeremiah 38, verse 1, who wanted to set a trap and capture Jeremiah. Isn't this so cool that they found these exact names in Jerusalem right from the time of the Babylonian captivity? So these names and many others were mentioned on these bulai. Okay, how's everyone doing? Are we doing good? Yeah? All right. So right now we are going back to what was happening in Babylon. So I already mentioned that the books of Ezekiel and Daniel were written during this time. And so obviously we're going to be talking a little bit about Daniel and the stories in the book of Daniel. So we hear, for example, that Daniel interprets dreams, right? He interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dreams, and that he was very much loved and known, and kind of he had a big position over there. But also we hear about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who were thrown into the fiery furnace, but who exited out without a hair on their head burnt, right? So these stories happen in the book of Daniel during the time of the Babylonian exile. But then from here, the story changes a little bit. And I don't know if you've noticed, but in the book of Daniel, the kings changed. We heard about Nebuchadnezzar, but then we hear, for example, about King Darius, who's a very different king, and honestly, from a whole different time period. Because what happened is the Babylonian period didn't last very long. The Persians came in and they took over that part of the world. So during the story of Daniel in the lion's den, that was in the Persian period. It was not in the Babylonian period, although it was still in Babylon. So the story of Daniel and the lions then happened with King Darius, who was one of the Persian kings. And the Persians are believed to have come around 538 BC-ish, something around that time. And one of the things that we know that happened during this time is that King Cyrus decides to allow the Jewish people to return home. And around 70 years after exile, after they were exiled out of their kingdom in Judah, they were finally allowed to come back, and they start rebuilding Jerusalem and rebuilding the temple. So we hear here stories about Nehemiah and Ezra, and they're rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem and reestablishing the temple worship. Okay, so they are coming back. And so they rebuild the temple, but it's not exactly the temple that Solomon had. It's much less magnificent than that was before. And it was a little more kind of built up later in King Herod's time. But nevertheless, this is when it started to be rebuilt again, to hopefully start bringing a little more of their culture and their traditions and their worship back. So yes, Ezra, Nehemiah, Daniel, Second Chronicles, these are the stories or these are the books that mention this time period, the shift towards the Persian period. And another fun Bible meets history fact, I'm noticing, sorry if I'm going a little fast. There's a lot to cover, and I also don't notice how much lag time is in between. But here we have a cylinder that was found from that time, from the Persian time, and it's called the Cyrus Cylinder, and it has the story or the decree that Cyrus gave for the people to return back home. So again, it very much mirrors and connects to the stories in Chronicles that mention the kind of the full decree of King Cyrus telling the people to return home. So this is another fun Bible meets history fact. Okay, now we're nearing the end of the Old Testament. Okay, so we heard about Ezra and Nehemiah, and from here we also hear about Haggai and Zechariah and Malachi, who wrote books during this time. But there is one more kind of important book that I have to mention, and that is the Book of Esther. Now, why am I mentioning this one specifically? It's because when I was saying that the people were returning back to the land, not everyone came back. It has been 70 years for people in exile. So people have already settled in their communities. Some people like where they were living. Maybe the land was pretty good. Most of them, maybe they didn't want to come back and start from scratch. You don't know, but what we do know is that most people stayed in their communities all over the world. And one of the stories that kind of shows that is the story of Esther, which happened around this time after when supposedly people were coming back, but it was located in Persia. Okay, so that was kind of happening around the same time as well. But for those people who were in the land, it is time to restart the traditions and to start to take their kind of the traditions and the worship a lot more seriously. But also what needed to happen is that they have to find now a new way to connect these people from all over the world, where up until now everything was directed to be about the temple and the temple worship. But how do you do that when all over the world people can't come all of that at the same time to the temple? So something had to be changed. So from here, we are basically at the end of the Old Testament, and we hear, of course, many prophecies about the coming Messiah and even about John the Baptist, who was going to prepare the way. And yeah, and the Old Testament basically kind of stops or ends. And from here, we enter this period kind of that was given this mysterious name, the 400 years of silence. Now, I'm not going to dig too deeply into this because we did do a whole hour session about the 400 years of silence, which is so exciting and so fascinating. There are amazing stuff that happened in this. And I recommend that you go and watch it to learn about all the great stuff that happened. And you will find it on our website on walkingtheholyland.com. So yeah, but we are going to mention a little bit of what happened over there, and that is that basically there were a lot of changes in power that led to the different things that happened in the New Testament. Because we ended with the Persians, but then suddenly in the New Testament we started with the Romans, right? So there was a little bit of a transition that had to happen. So first of all, the Old Testament ended around 400 BC. And it was still around it was still with the Persians at the time. The Persian Empire was there, but the Persian Empire falls to the Greeks and Alexander the Great around the year 332 BC. And so over here at the time, they had the Greeks taking over, and they called also this period the Hellenistic period because there was a kind of combination of different cultures, and the Greek language was introduced and Greek names and so on and so forth. But then this group of people called the Maccabees or the Hasmoneans, who were Jewish, who were a Jewish family, decided to revolt against the Greeks because they found they were very corrupt, and ended up taking autonomy over the country for a little short time. So they got into power around 167 BC, and it's during actually that time of the Maccabees and the Hasmoneans that the story of Hanukkah happened, which is why I have the Chanukiah or the menorah thing at the side. It's not a menorah, by the way. It's a Chanukiah. It has 2 extra branches than the one that's located in the temple. But nevertheless, it does connect to the story. So we've got the Maccabees or the Hasmoneans. And then in 63 BC, Rome takes over the world and takes over this part of the land as well. And when they are over here, they appoint King Herod to be a king, or to be a client king. King Herod was technically part Jewish or part Jewish convert, but he was chosen by Rome to kind of be a king over the Jewish people, but also directly under them. So they didn't have their full autonomy. Actually, the last time they did have autonomy was probably during the Hasmonean times. So as we are seeing over here, we are transitioning into the New Testament. Now, before I go over there, I want you just to quickly notice the years of King Herod. King Herod is believed to have been king from around 37 BC till around 4 BC. Okay, and I'll mention why that's interesting in just a second. So from here, we enter the New Testament. And we're not going to dwell too much on here, but of course it is worth mentioning. The New Testament starts in the Roman period, the time where the Jewish people are under this Roman oppression and they're paying a lot of taxes and struggling. And so they're more than ever crying out for a Messiah. But of course, they had a specific kind of idea of who the Messiah would be and that he would come and rescue them from the Romans. But of course, God had a whole different idea in mind, which was to rescue them from sin, which happened all the way back in the book of Genesis, right? So we know that Jesus came And it is believed, or it has been kind of passed on, that he was born around 0, which is kind of everything before Christ was BC, and everything after that was like from Christ forward. So we usually associate his birth around 0. But as I mentioned, King Herod was believed to have died around 4 BC after they did some of the calculations, which probably puts Jesus's birth around maybe 4 or even 6 BC. That is not actually really much the point. That doesn't really matter. The point is that Jesus came, and that he was here for 33 years, and that he spent his last 3 years serving and ministering and healing the people and raising the dead, and healing the sick and teaching everyone about the word, about the kingdom of God. And finally he was crucified, and 3 days later he was resurrected, right? So that's the important thing of what happened in the New Testament. And we do know that after Jesus resurrected, he promised that he would be coming back. And in the meantime, his followers were building the church, which started just as in the homes. People were gathering, were worshiping God, and were telling people about God. And it started growing more and more from here forward. And slowly it started to spread even outside of this land. It started in Judea, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the rest of the world, right? And so we have the different books in the New Testament, the different writings, the different kind of apostles, and Paul, who wrote the different books. And finally, the last book believed to have been Revelation. And all of those books are estimated to have been written around, let's say, 50 to 60 years after the Messiah. So very close in time to after the resurrection happened, and all still during the Roman period. And that set a whole different course to the history of Christianity and the history of the world, because suddenly from here on out, Christianity ended up affecting rulers, affecting countries, and had its effect continuously. Now, when it comes to actually history, does history prove that Jesus existed? History does not dispute that. They do believe that Jesus as a man existed during that time. And there are many references to it. And I'm just going to mention one in this specific case. And it is from a person called Tacitus, who was kind of a scribe who wrote during the time of Emperor Nero. And he says that Emperor Nero falsely blamed the Christians. And he says, he falsely blamed the persons commonly called the Christians, who were hated for their enormities. And Christus, the founder of the name, was put to death by Pontius Pilate, the procurator of Judea in the reign of Tiberius. So this shows us that actually Jesus was known, or Christ was known at the time as well. It gives us some interesting names like Pontius Pilate, which we know of directly from the story of the crucifixion, right? And speaking of Pilate, there's another find that they found in the land of Israel. They found this in Caesarea, which they found this big kind of huge stone. And if you have been to Caesarea, this very big, beautiful city, Roman city by the sea, you would find that there is this big stone which actually mentions the name Pilate, or Pontius Pilate. And I don't speak Latin, but even I can recognize this. See, if you can look over here. Do you see that where my mouse is? It says Pilatvs or something like that. That's, I'm anglicizing it. So it obviously says Pilatus, or we can immediately kind of associate it with probably Pontius Pilatus. Okay, it's pretty much a unique name. And this is only one of the quite a few finds that they found about the different kind of leaders during this time of the crucifixion, specifically here, Pontius Pilate. And one more fun find that they found from that time period, they also call it the Second Temple period, from the time where the Second Temple was, is that they found this kind of heel bone with a nail sticking through it. And they believe that this was one of the examples of the way people were crucified at the time. So this is, again, just kind of a little reference back to the story of crucifixion, that it happened during the time of the Romans. And yeah, so this is a random person's heel. It is not Jesus, because Jesus is alive, and he is alive until today and forevermore. All right, and we know that the message of the cross stands forth and is still resounding on and on, even until today. And we are excited for his coming back, correct? Yes. Okay, so let's quickly overview what we were talking about. And so we talked that the Bible was basically one big story. It had a beginning and followed basically one family line all the way until the end of the New Testament. Right, we talked about the Canaanite period, which had the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and even when the story went into Egypt. We've got the Judges period, which the different judges were leading. We mentioned Samuel and Samson, Deborah, and those stories that happened during the Judges period. The Israelites period is basically the kings, David and Hezekiah, and so on and so forth, up until first the Assyrians, but the Babylonians came in. There was a short rule by the Babylonians, and then the Persians took over. And this is where the Old Testament basically ended. And the Hellenistic period is basically the Greek period. The Hasmoneans were the Maccabees, again, story of Hanukkah. And then we heard about the Romans who came in, and it was during the Roman period that Jesus came, and the Roman period continued onward up until actually the Roman name, kind of the Roman period, changed to Byzantine, which basically just refers to Christianity having effect on the Roman world, and from then on the name changed. Okay, so but up until now in the Old Testament, it was the Roman period. Now, I do also want to note this and mention, but it is believed that the Bible was written by around 40 different authors over a period of 1,500 different years. And so people actually got to questioning, well, can the Bible be trusted? Could the Bible have changed over time? Would different people write about different things? Well, maybe the words, they changed or they transformed over a period of time. Can the word of God endure up until today, up until the books that we are reading today? And with that, I want to finish with this final Bible meets history. And I'm sure many of you know about this, but I think it's still worth mentioning that they found these 2,000-year-old scrolls in the Qumran caves by the Dead Sea. And what they were these copies and copies and copies of scripture, of the different books of the Bible. And I think almost all of the books of the Bible were found. And 2,000 years ago, meaning they were written around the time of Jesus and maybe a little bit before. And what's fascinating and amazing is that when they compared them to the writings that they have today, to the Bible they have today, they found that they were identical, which this proves once and for all that God's word endures forever. All right, and I'm finishing with these final two verses. Matthew 5 verse 18 says, "For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished." And I don't know about you, but I get encouraged by seeing all of these evidences and seeing how the word of God endures over time. And it reminds me once again of this verse, which I will be leaving with you, is trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight.